What we got today is a $5,000 buy-in with an interesting mix of characters. I'm sat in between DQ on my direct right, who will be playing over 50% of the hands dealt to him as usual, and Doug Polk on my direct left, who just happens to be one of the best poker players in the world. That dynamic will come into play throughout this session and especially later on. That said, anything can happen at any time with anybody at this table, whether it's my buddy Brad Owen down at the other end, Caitlin, who's gotten me real good in a bomb pot in a previous video, or any other participant at the table. This is about the fifth hand off the deck, and things are already getting spicy at this point. Shortly before this, we saw DQ get all in pre-flop with Jack-9 suited to stack Doug, so the ice has been broken following that five-figure pot. Action starts here with Chase raising from the hijack to $225. Brad calls in position, Slicer calls in the small blind, and it's over to us looking down at two jacks in the straddle spot. This rates to be the best hand, and it's a great squeeze spot with several $100s in the middle. And even though we wouldn't necessarily love to see a 5-bet jam after we 4-bet, we're still gonna have to go with it, especially down here in Texas.
Andrew wakes up with pocket jacks here.
The jiggities.
King Queen for multiple players, and the slot machine sevens for Brad in the seventh seat. Let's see if the poker gods are with him, and if he elects to go set mining here with all this action. Andrew 3-bets to 1.4. I imagine Brad will be folding now. Chase a wild card. You never know how he's feeling, what he wants to do with his stack. But that's why we love him. An Austin local. But he gets away.
Once we make it through the initial raiser, we're usually in pretty good shape to take it down, and that is what happens, putting us up about $700 very early in the session. $80 double straddle on in this hand, and it folds over to me in the big blind looking down at a suited ace-5. Definitely a raising candidate, so I make it $250 to go, which could be a little small since we're out of position the entire hand, but not an unreasonable size. Doug makes the call next to me, and Brad comes along as well. So the three amigos are off to a flop here. 10-7 deuce with two clubs and one diamond. Being out of position versus two players on a semi-wet board, I elect to check it before Doug puts out a smallish bet. Brad folds, and versus that size, I think we can peel here. I'm obviously not completely in love with the flop, but sometimes we're ahead, and there's also a bunch of helpful turn card possibilities. So I make the call, but we don't find any improvement on the turn. So when I check and Doug fires again, I think we're basically handcuffed, and I give it up. After that hand, a fairly significant amount of time goes by, during which I get dealt lots of garbage hands and have to fold a lot, putting me back down around $600 or so in the red. An interesting spot eventually comes up when DQ opens this hand for $105 over a $20 straddle. I look down at 9-7 suited, which I think can be played as a call or a raise. In a lot of typical low or mid-stakes casino poker games, this isn't a great hand to flat with because the rake will have an impact on its profitability. That's not the case here since no money comes off of these tables. That said, flatting invites other players in behind me to either call or squeeze me out. And one of those players behind me is Doug Polk. So if I can raise and isolate with a 3-bet, pushing Doug and the rest of the players out while also disguising my hands on some various boards, I think that makes a ton of sense. I go for it with a 3-bet to $325, which unfortunately turns out to be subpar timing, as DQ has the goods this time and puts the hammer down.
All in.
All in. So that will do it for Andrew.
Wow.
From 225 to 9.4K, and he shows it to him.
A couple hands later, we see coins limp into the pot in late position. Kind of a similar dynamic here to the previous hand. My hand is okay, not super exciting, but once again, if I could push a couple of the guys out here and go heads up versus a capped range that limped in, that seems like it's an okay result pre-flop. I raise this Jack King off to $200 out of the blinds, and we get what we want. Heads up, go into the flop. Ace 10-6 with a flush draw. We flop some equity with a Broadway draw and also have the initiative here, so I think a C-bet is very reasonable to try and fold out small and medium pairs. I bet $180 and coins immediately calls, making those pairs a little unlikely. No help for us on the turn, and it adds some other connectivity that might be good for my opponent, so I slow it down with a check, and coins checks back right away. We do improve on the river, giving a second pair, but it's the third heart, and we don't have any of those. I check it again, hoping to get to showdown, but coins says show this down, betting $500. A little unsure here facing this bet but without blocking any flushes, I'm thinking I'm just gonna have to give it up. And after I let it go, coins shows me the queen jack, which makes a straight on the river. Looking back, it was a very good situation pre-flop, getting heads up versus a dominated hand, but unfortunately the board did not cooperate. Caitlin finds a raise in this hand to 90 bucks. I find a pair in the small blind. Pairs are good. I call, and so does Brad. 3 ways to a flop, giving us a gut shot wheel draw. Check to the initial raiser who c-bets. With a pair plus draw, I call, and Brad actually folds the best hand, which is great for us and puts us into the lead here. That is until the turn card comes, giving Caitlin second pair. Not surprisingly, action goes check, check, and the river comes a queen. I have a tiny bit of unimproved showdown value, albeit not a lot, so when I check and Caitlin bets big here, I start thinking about some different options. I don't think calling is great because I can't beat much of anything at this point. Raising seems better because she's capped a bit after checking back the turn, and I don't think she'd always bet pocket queens on the flop. So I'm thinking about a raise here with the straight blockers, but deuce 4 isn't really all that likely for me either. I give her credit, which looking at the actual hands here is probably a good decision. Chris gets involved here with a raise from under the gun. I look at king 6 suited on the button, a little loose, but having nut position and trying to make something good happen leans me into defending the button, and everyone else folds. 9-8-6 with a flush draw.
We flop a pair, so when Chris bets $100, that's good enough to call with. Turn is a 10, putting 4 to a straight on the board. Now he slows down with a check, and I'm not sure how good bottom pair is on this board versus his range. So I'm gonna look to turn it into a bluff now and bet $230.
With Chris's exact hand, of course, he's not folding, so we're off to a river card, which pairs the board. Chris checks again, and I don't think it makes sense to make a large wager here. After I bet the turn, my most likely value holdings are straights, so when the board pairs, I'm not likely to be holding a full house. I still don't think I have the best hand, but also don't think an overpair is gonna love this board or the story that I've been telling.
So I bluff at it for $580.
I thought a dominated gutter where he had the higher version of the same gutter.
Goes for
Turn it back for
580.
flush draw. Check, raised him huge. He called, hit the river with a flush
Chris
that gave him
contemplating a fold, never raising here, but has not put the chips in yet.
But I was jamming bricks.
But I don't imagine he'll be folding here for the price of 580.
But when you just get there
And he makes the call.
He had the nut flush draw too.
Chris makes a good call, which seems kind of tough looking at how this board runs out and having blocked flush draws. But it's hard to make a pair in this game, and even harder to make top pair, so take it down, Chris. $20 straddle on, and I raise it to $70 with the king 10 suited. Dr. Evil calls on the button. And Chris calls in the straddle, so 3 ways to a flop, giving us top pair, okay kicker, but it's always a tricky spot multi-way with this vulnerable of a hand. Chris checks, and I want to bet something, deciding on $100, which gets called by both players, meaning we're either ahead by a little or we're already behind. Turn is a total brick, and after Chris checks, I'm not going to try and push what little equity advantage I may or may not have here, so I slow it down with a check, and Doug checks back on the button. The river improves us to trips, and now Chris leads out for $375. Nothing much to be said here. We didn't face a raise on the flop. We're getting a good price, and if he ever has a bluff or worse king after closing the action pre-flop, all of which I think is possible, then it's an easy call. I Hollywood for a little bit, knowing that I'm calling, but hoping by some miracle I can induce an overcall by worse from Doug, but it's not going to matter since we're never winning this pot in this instance. Pocket 7's first to act after DQ's $40 straddle. I make it $125, which only gets called by Mr. Max Payne himself. The two of us go heads up to a flop, which comes down bad for my hand, but great for my range. DQ checks dark, and I bet $75 on this flop, which he promptly calls. Finally, we see a little bit of run good, drilling the offsuit 7 on the turn and switching us from bluffing to value betting. $230, which I think is too small since DQ will likely call more with any ace or flush draw. But value is value, and we get called again. DQ immediately announces he's looking for a diamond because that's just how he rolls, but the river does not deliver, and there will not be any more value to be found with our set.
400 fold.
Don't like DQ. Table talk there. A little bit too much there. Checks blind. Really gives himself no options to winning this pot.
In this hand, DQ is about 20 feet away from the table, which doesn't prevent him from raising to $45, and I look down at king queen off. Versus the blind hand, this is essentially us opening the pot, so I put in the 3-bet to $150. Slicer calls in the blinds.
DQ 150.
DQ calls the 150, not even at the table. From the other side of the room, might even be in a porta potty. Who knows where DQ is, but he still calls 150.
Free player.
Ace, king, 5, rainbow. It checks to me. I think betting full range on this board as a 3-better is fine, so that's what I do. Slicer is out, and DQ finally looks at his hand. It's worth a continue because it's DQ's world and we are just living in it.
And Andrew's night cannot get any worse. DQ blind.
We can allow that.
He's got an ace.
All in a check turn.
Turn is the deuce of clubs, and I'm going to check it back this time. River seems meaningless here, and now DQ leads for $250. Not too many bluffs available, but when the guy raises and calls pre-flop from 20 feet away from the table, sometimes you just got to pay him off. We find another king-queen here and raise it up to $125. Chris defends the button, and likewise for DQ in the $40 straddle. 3 ways to king 10-10 with 2 diamonds. Reasonable spot for me to wager, so I bet 1/3 of the pot. Chris pounces on it, making a small raise to $300. With the player behind him and having position to flat with his draws, this has me worried a bit, but of course, we can't fold for this price with this hand. Turn is a brick, and after I check, Chris bets $400 this time. Not a large bet, and there's a flush draw that I don't block, so with top pair, I'm gonna have to call again here and see what develops. River is another brick, and after I check, Chris unloads the last chamber betting $1,000. Triple barrels aren't all that frequent, especially ones that start multi-way on the flop, facing a c-bet from the initial raiser, and especially once we get into 4-digit wager territory by the river. That's the exploitative me thinking and talking out loud here. What I should be doing is thinking about 2 things. 1, the fact that I don't have any diamonds or hearts in my hand, unlocking both flush draws on the flop, and 2, that if I fold here, then I'm only calling with trips plus or ace-king, which is just way too narrow considering just how wide we can see Chris is raising here on the flop. Of course, it's super easy to analyze several days later with the benefit of seeing the hold cards, but in the moment I'm lamenting about how bad I tend to run on live streams, which isn't a winning mindset and leads me to make a bad fold here on the river with nowhere near enough thought put into it in the moment. My first ever experience with Texas stand-up in this hand, aka the stand-up game. All players start by standing up, and when you win a hand, you get to sit back down. Seems pretty simple. However, the last person to remain standing has to pay a bounty to all of the other players, in this case, $100 to each player, which is a $700 loss for not winning a hand. It's a fun way to shake things up, and there's a bit of strategy involved here because it becomes more important to try and win a hand and avoid that bounty, which of course means more action. In this hand, I find King Jack suited and Doug being Doug, and understanding these dynamics puts in a 3-bet to $300 on the button. I'm going nowhere with 40% of a royal flush, of course, and we go heads up to a flop. Ace Jack 6 rainbow, good flop for Douglas to c-bet, but after making a pair, I'm not folding. We can move through the rest of the hand pretty quickly because Doug shuts it down, seeing me continue on that dry flop, and my pair of jacks are going to be good to win the hand at showdown, allowing me to retake my seat and avoid the $700 Texas stand-up penalty. $40 straddle on here, and DQ makes it $180 to go on the button. Big open size, but that's not going to prevent me from a re-raise with the ace-queen out of position here. I make it $525 to go out of the small blind, and DQ did not bring his own chair to this poker game, just to fold a suited connector. Heads up to a favorable flop, giving us top 2 pair.
Pair ace. What is
2 pair actually for Andrew?
DQ checking Andrew's pulse?
I'm going to c-bet a lot of the time here, especially this time, and make it $330. DQ has a little something at least and continues with a call. Turn is a king, adding a second flush draw. Jack 10 is certainly a possibility since that was a double gutter on the flop, but I'll be damned if I'm going to worry about that one hand and give a free card here. I fire again for $700, but it's just not enough hand for DQ to continue this time, so after not too much thought, he lets it go. $40 straddle on and raise from Chris up to $125 first to act. 2 spots over, Slicer finds something worthy of even more money and makes it $400 to go. Action folds over to me in the small blind, looking down at something that could be worthy of even more money. Playing out of the small blind is never ideal, especially versus multiple opponents. If I flat here, I give a good price for the initial raiser to come along, and then we have to play out of position versus both opponents in that case. That leads me to want to take the aggressive route with a good hand like this, attempting to win at pre-flop and denying my opponents that positional advantage. I make it $1,300 to go. And looking at all of the cards that hit the muck here, this is a disaster unfolding. Doug folds the ace queen next to me and Chase folds ace 6 next to him. This isn't good.
Slicer rips it. Andrew,
Big
unlikely
flag.
to be putting in a 4-bet and folding here. He hates it. Did not really want to see that. Makes the call.
Fans want Andrew to win. No offense, but they're getting paid.
Big Slick versus Kings.
Wow, thanks, Doug.
Looking for an ace is
Way to give your friend
Must not have been
Andrew
Super
Neeme.
Bowl.
And we saw Doug fold one of his outs, and there was another ace folded.
Ace
So
of clubs is the only thing available.
no help on this run out so far.
Barry Greenstein?
Ace on the river. Nope.
$11,000 pot going to Slicer here, which is not a fun amount to be losing half of. I started this hand with a little over $5,000, which translates to 125 big blinds effective if you consider the $40 straddle. I don't hate my line, and it's another form of run bad, but I do wonder if a flat isn't the worst play in the world, considering that the initial raise came from the first position to act, and there was a 3-bet only 2 spots over from that open. But when things aren't going your way, it's tough to hit the brakes when you see something as pretty as ace king and you want to try and make something good happen. Stuck piles now with 100% of my own action in this game. I reload yet again, trying to dig deep and hope for some run good to eventually find its way to me. In this hand, we have a limped pot and 6-9 suited in the blinds. We flop an open ender, and having a wide enough range while also blocking straights, I lead into the field for $60. Action folds to DQ, who isn't going to let me take it that easily. Turn is a good card, completing our straight, which is unexpected because I usually have nothing. But this time I bet for $175. DQ doesn't have enough here, calling when he's ahead, but lets it go when he's behind, and we win a small one. In this next one, DQ finds a playable one, making it $130 to go from the hijack. I have a hand that does okay multi-way, so I'm all right to flat this one in position. Brad's in there as well, out of the big blind, and the straddler gets out of the way. 3 ways this time to 7-5-3 with 2 hearts. Brad checks, and so does DQ. Betting is fine with this equity, but checking with ace high is also reasonable, so I check it back. Turn isn't great since it might remove our overcards as outs now, but after Brad leads out and DQ folds, I'm definitely not in a folding mood. I make the call with what is actually the best hand here, and the river seals the deal for us. Brad's too good to blindly fire away, so he gives it up here. I'm wagering and praying that he has a straight, but there isn't going to be any value to be found from the king high. That is a couple of hands in a row though, and I'll take what I can get at this point. The hijack and the button limp into this one for $80 after the double straddle, and I see queen jack suited in the first straddle. Similar dynamics in play as I mentioned earlier. We have some capped ranges and a world-class player on my left yet to act. Rather than overlimp and let him in for cheap, even though I'm out of position, I'd still prefer to take the initiative with a very playable hand and raise it up to $400. Chase gets out of the way, and I'm thinking it's likely that I'll win this one pre-flop, but Chris then decides the button is too valuable to give up that easily, and he makes the call. Heads up to a flop of 8-8-7, which isn't much help as paired boards typically tend not to be. I'm going to keep my story going and continue with a wager of $275. Chris has enough happening here with his hand that he's not ready to fold. Turn is an interesting one because although it doesn't add any equity for us, it's one of the few cards that will be likely much better for me than for him. That's what I'm hoping for Chris to also believe, so I fire again here for $525. Chris thinks for a little while, but still not ready to surrender. Little do I know at the time that I'm actually betting with the best hand here. I'm thinking that he has a 7 a lot of the time, and maybe the occasional 8. That last hand class becomes even less likely when the river brings yet another 8, and heavily shifting his most likely hands to a 7. Needing to bet again to fold that type of hand out, I reach down and grab 10 of those black $100 chips and drop them into the middle. Again, of course, not realizing that I actually somehow have the best hand here and hoping to keep this comeback train moving in the right direction.
Andrew makes a big, this is going to be extremely, he can't just call, obviously. He's either coming over the top here or folding. And he lets it go, and Andrew wins with queen high. There you go, folks. Andrew getting a nice little $3,600 pot.
Action folds to me here in the big blind with the queen 10 off, out of position versus the $40 straddle. I make it $125. Again, maybe on the small side, but not terribly so. Doug and Chase both call, and we go three ways to queen, queen, 3. Things definitely looking up lately, and I'm going to put a small wager in here to try and allow my opponents to continue widely. Doug finds the float while Chase gets out of the way. Offsuit king, which I might bet for value or as a bluff, so I fire again for $250. And even though Doug turns a gutter, he wisely lets it go. But we're on the grind here and have recaptured about $2,500 worth of our losses so far. Caitlin opens the button here for $90 before DQ finds something he likes the looks of, making it $410 out of the big blind. Next to act, we look down at the second best hand ever created, and with a raise and a re-raise in front of us, and a bunch of momentum as of late. No way we're flatting and giving a good price to those behind us. There's a 4-bet coming, and we just need to figure out a size. It doesn't need to be the full 3x, since it shouldn't be hard to threaten the full stack in a 4-bet pot, but I also think we can go for a reasonable amount of value. And if they happen to fold and we profit $500 without a flop, that's not the best but not the worst result either. I decide on a size of $1,100. Doug is out of the way, and Caitlin, the initial raiser, can't continue here and folds 2. Back to DQ, who thinks it over briefly before deciding on a flat call. The two of us are off to a flop where I'm looking to dodge the overcard.
Here's the flop.
No, yes.
Ooh, an ace and a king set for Andrew. 2 pair for DQ. This is Danger Will Robinson. All chips are going in play this hand.
But if we can't dodge the overcard, then let's do this instead. DQ gives a bit of a speech about me re-raising pre-flop, and then an ace and a king come on the flop before checking it over to me. And once again, I like a bet with my full range in this spot, typically for 1/4 pot. So that's what I wager. $550, praying DQ has something he can continue with. It takes about 9 seconds before DQ says those magic words.
$550 bet. All in call. Oh my goodness. Andrew's just about to double up here.
That's why it's going to hurt.
DQ looking for the ace of clubs.
There's $14,000 in the middle. This is the second biggest pot I've ever played in my life. We were stuck early on and got into a big hole in this session. In fact, it's the most I've ever been stuck. But now we're on the momentum train, and winning this pot would get us all the way back out. What's even better is that Doug folded the ace of hearts, so that leaves one single out to escape for DQ.
Oh my goodness! Oh my goodness! The ace of clubs! The one outer! DQ! I don't believe what I just saw! One out. Stunned, folks.
I'm not. Where'd the kings go?
I'm speechless, folks. DQ thought he hit the world with 2 pair, top 2. Andrew waiting for him with a set. Needless to say, that was such a sick one outer.